The midday sun blazed over Brighton Park's annual charity fair, casting sharp shadows across the crowded lawn where families clustered around food trucks and game booths. Children's laughter mixed with the tinny sound of carnival music, creating a wall of noise that seemed to pulse with the heat. Then, cutting through it all, came a sound that made heads turn, a guttural, sustained bark that carried urgency and something darker. A German shepherd, ribs visible beneath matted fur, had broken free from the animal rescue tent at the far end of the grounds. The dog's paws tore across the grass with desperate speed, eyes locked on something ahead. Volunteers from the rescue organization shouted behind it, their voices lost in the commotion as the crowd began to scatter. Parents grabbed their children. A woman screamed. The dog wasn't slowing down. It was heading straight for the senior activity area, where a group of elderly men sat in folding chairs, playing chess and talking in the shade of an oak tree. One man remained perfectly still. Harold Jameson, 73 years old, sat alone at the edge of the group, his weathered hands resting on the arms of his chair. While others stumbled backward or moved toward safety, Harold didn't flinch. His eyes, pale blue and steady, tracked the approaching animal with an expression impossible to read. The German shepherd closed the distance in seconds, 50 feet, 30, 10, its trajectory unwavering. The dog skidded to a halt directly in front of Harold's chair, chest heaving, tongue lolling from exertion. But it didn't lunge. It didn't growl. Instead, the animal dropped into a sitting position, rigid and controlled, and raised its right paw in a formal salute. The crowd fell silent. Harold's throat worked, swallowing once, then twice. His hand trembled as it reached forward, not to pet, but to grasp the dog's raised paw in a handshake that looked practiced, ceremonial. Before we continue with what happens next, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Atlas, Harold whispered, his voice cracking on the single word. The dog's ears pinned back, not in fear but in recognition, and a high whine escaped its throat. Harold's other hand moved to the animal's head, fingers finding the ridge of scar tissue hidden beneath fur just behind the left ear. His thumb traced it with the familiarity of someone who'd touched that exact spot 1,000 times before. It's you. God help me. It's really you. The rescue volunteer who'd been chasing the dog finally reached them, breathless and apologetic. She was young, maybe 25, with a clipboard clutched against her chest and confusion written across her face. "Sir, I'm so sorry. He's been traumatized, we think, from abuse. He's been with us for 3 weeks and hasn't let anyone near him. We only brought him today because we thought the crowd might help with socialization, but he's unpredictable and—" She stopped, registering the scene before her. The dog that had snarled at every handler, that had refused food from human hands, was now pressed against Harold's legs, shaking. Harold didn't look at her. His focus remained on the dog, on the way Atlas's eyes, one brown, one clouded with the white of an old injury, searched his face. "What did you say his name was?" Harold asked quietly. "We've been calling him Gunner. He had no tags, no chip. Found him 3 states over, wandering near an interstate. Severely malnourished, defensive aggression, wouldn't respond to any commands." The volunteer crouched down, keeping her distance. "Sir, do you know this dog?" Harold's jaw tightened. He'd known this conversation would come someday, had rehearsed it in his head during sleepless nights for the past 6 years. But now that the moment had arrived, the words felt insufficient. "His name is Atlas. He was my partner." He paused, chest rising with a deep breath. "Military working dog. We served together in Afghanistan, 2012 to 2015. He saved my life more times than I can count." The murmur that rippled through the gathering crowd was almost reverent. People edged closer, drawn by the unfolding drama. The volunteer's expression shifted from confusion to awe. "But that was—" "Sir, that's almost 10 years ago. Military dogs are retired with their handlers. How did he end up—" "He wasn't retired to me." Harold's voice turned brittle. "Atlas was reassigned. Younger handler, another deployment. I was told it was protocol, that I'd aged out, that my injuries made me ineligible to adopt him even after his service was complete." His hand never stopped moving over the dog's head, fingers working through tangles and matted fur with gentle persistence. "They sent him overseas again. Then I lost track of him in the system. Bureaucracy, red tape. By the time I finally got answers, he'd been transferred to a contractor facility, and they claimed he'd been adopted out. Dead end after dead end." Atlas pressed harder against Harold's legs, a low sound vibrating in his chest that wasn't quite a whine, wasn't quite a growl. It was grief-given voice. Harold's eyes, which had remained dry through 3 tours of duty and a wife's funeral, finally betrayed him. A single tear tracked down his weathered cheek and disappeared into his grey beard. The volunteer pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Sir, I need to make some calls. If what you're saying is true, there are records, protocols. This dog's history should have been flagged in the system." She looked up, professional mask slipping to reveal something gentler. "But honestly, the way he's responding to you, I don't need paperwork to know you're telling the truth." A man stepped forward from the crowd, middle-aged with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "I'm Tom Richards, director of the rescue organization. Mr. Jameson, is it?" He extended his hand, which Harold shook without standing, unwilling to disturb Atlas. "We need to understand what happened to this dog. He arrived at our facility 3 weeks ago in terrible condition, not just malnourished, but psychologically damaged. Wouldn't eat for the first 4 days. We had to sedate him for medical examination. He's been living in isolation because we couldn't risk placing him." Harold's expression hardened. "What kind of examination?" Tom hesitated, then seemed to decide honesty was warranted. "Healed fractures in 3 ribs, partial hearing loss in the left ear. Dental damage consistent with biting metal, probably cage bars, cigarette burns on his hindquarters, old but distinctive. Someone hurt him, Mr. Jameson, systematically." The crowd's silence deepened, uncomfortable and waiting. Harold's hand stilled on Atlas's head. When he spoke again, his voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting facts to maintain composure. "Atlas was trained for explosive detection and patrol. He found IEDs that would have killed dozens. He took shrapnel meant for me in Kandahar. After I was discharged for medical reasons, they told me he had years of service left in him, that it would be wasteful to retire him. I believed them because I wanted to believe the system took care of its own." He looked down at the dog, whose eyes hadn't left his face. "I filed adoption paperwork every 6 months for 3 years. Every request denied. By year 4, the contractor said he'd been placed with a qualified home. They wouldn't tell me where, wouldn't confirm if he was even alive." His voice roughened. "I stopped looking because I thought I was being selfish, thought maybe he'd found a better life than what I could give him." A young boy, maybe 9 years old, pushed through the adults to the front of the circle. "Mister, is he a hero dog?" The child's eyes were wide, earnest. His mother reached to pull him back, but Harold shook his head. "Yes, son, he's a hero. Saved more lives than most people ever will." Harold managed a sad smile. "And someone repaid him with cruelty." Tom crouched down to their level, maintaining respectful distance from Atlas. "Mr. Jameson, I need to be transparent with you. Our policy requires a home visit, reference checks, a trial period, but I'm also not blind." He gestured to the dog, who had shifted to place himself between Harold and the rest of the crowd, protective instincts clearly intact, despite years of abuse. Atlas made his choice the second he saw you. The question is whether you're able to take him home. Do you have stable housing? Financial means for veterinary care? He's going to need behavioral rehabilitation, possibly medication for anxiety. Harold's laugh was short and humorless. I'm a retired Marine Corps sergeant living on pension and disability. I have a small house with a fenced yard. No family to speak of. Wife passed 4 years ago. Kids grown and scattered across the country. I was at this fair today because the senior center director thought I needed to engage with the community more. He looked directly at Tom. I have money saved because I had no one to spend it on. I have time because I have nothing but time. And I have experience with traumatized beings because I look at one in the mirror every morning. The volunteer who'd been making calls stepped back into the conversation, her expression complicated. Mr. Richards, I just spoke with our regional coordinator. There's a flag in the system for this dog. Case number indicates he was seized from a foreclosed property in Missouri 2 months ago, along with 6 other animals. Owner died, no next of kin. Animals left abandoned. By the time animal control got there, she trailed off, glancing at the crowd of families and children. How long? Harold's question was simple, direct. Unknown. Possibly weeks. She swallowed hard. The other animals didn't make it. Atlas shifted, pressing his scarred head harder into Harold's palm, and the old man's composure finally cracked. His shoulders shook once, twice, then steadied with visible effort. He survived because that's what we trained him to do. Survive, adapt, complete the mission. He leaned down until his forehead touched Atlas's. The mission was to get home, wasn't it, boy? You never stopped trying to complete it. Tom stood, making a decision that would likely generate paperwork and questions from his superiors, but feeling certain it was the right one. Mr. Jameson, I'm going to expedite this adoption. We'll need basic information, a home address for follow-up, and you'll need to sign acknowledgement of Atlas's medical and behavioral needs. But I'm not making you jump through hoops that would insult both your service and his. The crowd, which had swelled to perhaps 50 people, began to applaud. It started soft, almost hesitant, then built until the sound rolled across the fairgrounds. Harold barely heard it. He was focused on the work of standing, his arthritic knees protesting. One hand braced on the chair arm while the other remained on Atlas. The dog stood with him, moving in perfect synchronization, positioning himself to take some of Harold's weight, the way he'd been trained to do for wounded soldiers a decade ago. "Come on, Atlas," Harold said, his voice steadier now. "Let's go home." They walked together through the parted crowd, the old man and the scarred dog, moving slowly toward the parking lot. Atlas maintained perfect heel position, his gait slightly uneven from old injuries, but his attention unwavering. Behind them, the volunteer gathered paperwork and wiped at her eyes. Tom Richards watched them go, making a mental note to follow up personally, to ensure this reunion had a better ending than its middle chapters. At Harold's truck, an aging Ford with a faded Marine Corps decal on the rear window, the old man opened the passenger door. Atlas hesitated for the first time, eyes moving from the open door to Harold's face and back. 6 years of separation, 6 years of wondering if the bond that had sustained them through war could survive time and distance and trauma. Harold patted the seat. "Up, Atlas. That's an order." The dog jumped up with a grace that belied his condition, settling onto the cracked vinyl seat with a long exhale that sounded like relief. Harold closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side, moving carefully, his own scars and old wounds making themselves known. As he settled behind the wheel, Atlas leaned across the center console and rested his head on Harold's shoulder, the way he used to do during long patrols when they'd grab a few minutes of rest between missions. "I've got you," Harold whispered, starting the engine. "I've got you now, and I'm not letting go again. That's a promise." The truck pulled out of the parking lot as the sun began its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside, an old soldier and his war dog sat in comfortable silence, two survivors who had found their way back to each other against impossible odds. The mission, at long last, was complete. In the days that followed, Harold would learn the full scope of Atlas's suffering and begin the slow work of healing. They would establish new routines together, morning walks before the neighborhood woke, quiet evenings on the porch, visits to a veterinarian who specialized in trauma cases. Atlas would have nightmares, and Harold would wake to comfort him, speaking in the low, steady tone that had once calmed the dog during artillery fire. Harold would have nightmares too, and Atlas would press close, a solid, warm presence that anchored him to the present. The rescue organization would use their story in fundraising campaigns, and Harold would reluctantly agree to a few interviews, insisting that the focus remain on the broken systems that failed military working dogs rather than on sentiment. He would connect with other veterans searching for their retired partners, offering what help and resources he could. Atlas would never fully recover from what he'd endured in those lost years, but neither would he need to. Recovery wasn't the goal, living was the goal, and that they could do together. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 3 months after the reunion, Harold sat in his backyard, watching Atlas investigate the perimeter of the fence with the thoroughness of a professional. The dog's ribs no longer showed. His coat had regained some of its luster. The wariness in his eyes had softened, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Harold raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. "We made it, brother," he said to the morning air. "Different war, same team. We made it home." Atlas looked back at him across the yard, ears pricked forward, and in the steady gaze of that one good eye, Harold saw understanding. They had both been lost. They had both been found. And in the finding, they had saved each other one last time. The mission was complete, finally, truly complete.